All right, let's continue our study in Galatians chapter 4. And we're looking at verses 8 through verses 11. And we're talking about the fivefold appeal to be justified by faith alone. And in this study, appeal number 1 is, do not turn back. And as you recall, the aim of the lesson is to forge ahead in our Christian walk. And we've talked about point number 1, remember your former life. And we've talked about point number 2, and that is to look at your present life. You know you're known by God, and you know God. We've talked about point number 3, consider your turning back. And that's where we are right now as far as the lesson is concerned. And the last thing we said is, if the Galatians subjected themselves to the law and to a religion of works, they would be returning to a life of bondage. The bondage of working to get God to pay attention to them and to receive and accept them. Now the crucial point is this. There is no difference between seeking God through the law and seeking God through pagan worship. The foundation of all religious seeking, except Christianity, is the same. That of working to keep the laws that please a person's God with a little g. That of doing good so that a person's God with a little g will accept him. Now note that Paul calls man's elementary notions of God weak and beggarly. Let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, the law and other approaches to God are weak in that they are helpless in saving man. The law itself could only point out man's sin, but it could never justify and make him acceptable to God. And secondly, the law and other approaches to God are beggarly, that is, worthless in saving a man. The law itself is meaningless, of no use whatsoever in justifying and making man acceptable to God. It is not the law nor man's works and attempts to be good that saves him. Notice also that Paul illustrates his point by referring to special religious holidays. The point is that ritual, ceremony, and the keeping of religious days will not justify and make a person acceptable before God. Christ and Christ alone, faith in Him, is what saves a person. Now, second point on this third topic is this. Note the results of backsliding, of turning back to the world, and seeking to please God by self-effort and self-righteousness. Now, a couple of things I want to say about that. First of all, a person becomes enslaved in that he tries to please God by keeping the rules of the law, but he finds he cannot. But he still slavishly tries and tries again. However, it is all to no avail. For the man finds himself still in the bondage of sin and death. He still sins, and he still dies. And there's no absolute assurance within of eternal life. And it is the lack of assurance of knowing that one is acceptable to God that is so enslaving. The question and doubt of living with God gnaws and gnaws at man, always without the sure knowledge and assurance of God's love. Perfect assurance, confidence, and security come only through faith in Jesus Christ. And secondly, a person lives a wasted life. Every approach to God fails except faith in Jesus Christ. Every approach leads to death and condemnation. Therefore, every life that approaches God by any other means than faith in Jesus Christ is a wasted life. Jesus said in Luke chapter 9, verse 62, and Jesus said unto him, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. The writer of Hebrews said in Hebrews 10:38, now the just shall live by faith, but if any man draws back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. Now we're not talking about loss of salvation. We're talking about being saved and yet living a carnal, worldly life and backsliding and getting out of fellowship with God. Now what things would cause a Christian believer to backslide? Perhaps some illumination will come through this story. A Boy Scout was really excited about going on the annual winter camporee. With a couple of feet of snow on the ground, the setting was perfect for a great weekend. His was one of the first troops to hike in and set up camp. The Boy Scout, along with his troop, forged into the wilderness. Upon arrival, they set up camp and prepared for the weekend adventure. After pitching his tent, the Boy Scout realized that he had left something in the bus. So he proceeded to take the long walk back to the bus, which was a few miles away. Feeling confident in his retriever skills, he did not take care to look for the important landmarks that would show him the way back to camp. Coming back from the bus proved to be an unplanned adventure. The confusion from other scouts setting up their own camps caused him to question which path to take. After a while, every path looked the same. To say that he was getting worried would be an obvious observation. How could I have missed it? If only I could find something or someone familiar. Now the backslider is a lot like this confused Boy Scout. They forget to set familiar landmarks in place to keep themselves on track. Now what are those landmarks? Regular time in God's Word, frequent prayer, and accountable fellowship with other believers. Whatever happened to that backslidden Boy Scout, you might be wondering. Every approach to his camp ended in failure. Hours later, his scoutmaster found him and brought him back to the camp. And that is exactly what the great scoutmaster, the Good Shepherd, Jesus Christ, does for his wayward sheep. He finds them and brings them back to himself. Now, you've come too far to turn back now. There's no sense in backsliding, getting out of fellowship with God. Go ahead and take the risk. Follow hard after God. And as a matter of review, remember the three main points. First of all, remember your former life. Secondly, look at your present life. You know that you know God, and you know that you're known by God. And then consider the results from turning back. Now, let's take up appeal number 2. And that is to restir affection for the preacher of God. Now remember, we're talking about the fivefold appeal to be justified by faith alone. And in this study, we're going to talk about restoring your affection for the minister of God. And the aim of this lesson is to strongly support your preacher in word and in deed. And the memory verse would be Hebrews 13, verse 17. Hebrews 13, verse 17. Obey them that have rule over you and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. Now I want to read verses 12 through verse 20 in Galatians chapter 4, beginning with verse 12. Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as you are. You have not injured me at all. You know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. And my temptation which was in the flesh you despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. Where is then the blessedness you spake of? For I bear you record, that if it had been possible, ye have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? They zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you, that you might affect them. But it's good to be zealously affected always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you, I desire to be present with you now, and to change my voice, for I stand in doubt of you. Now, contrary to popular opinion, your preacher does not get dressed in a phone booth and come out with a large S on his shirt and a flowing cape tied at the base of his neck. In other words, he's not Superman. And instead of leaping buildings with a single bound, he is usually trying to keep the building which contains the congregation from flying apart. What is one of the most important missions of the preachers of God? One of the most vital duties is to restore sheep that have strayed away from the Lord. Backsliding people need appeal after appeal, for they are walking a dangerous course when they turn their backs upon God. Also, a backsliding person is usually alienated from his preacher. He wants little to do with the minister when he's turning away from God. The Galatian churches went even further. False teachers and critics of Paul had begun to attack Paul personally, both his person and his ministry. They were tearing down his character every way that they could. There was a great danger that the churches would reject his ministry. And therefore, Paul had to do all he could to stop the mess and save the churches from destruction and apostasy. This present passage that we've read is an appeal for the believers to remember and restore their affection for the preacher of God. Now the outline will have 4 points. Point 1 will be, treat the minister of God as a brother. And that's found in Galatians chapter 4, verse 12. Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are. You have not injured me at all. And point number 2 would be, welcome true preachers of God. Verses 13 through verse 16. You know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. And my temptation, which was in my flesh, you despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. Where is then the blessedness you spake of? For I bear you record, that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes, and had given them to me. Am I therefore become your enemy, because I tell you the truth? And the third point would be, guard against and reject false preachers. Verse 17. They zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you, that you might affect them. And the fourth point would be, receive true preachers always. Verse 18 through verse 20. But it is good to be zealously affected always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, of whom I travail in birth, again until Christ be formed in you, I desire to be present with you now, and to change my voice, for I stand in doubt of you. Now, let's take up the first point. Treat the minister of God as a brother, found in verse 12. Remember that some of the churches in Galatia were criticizing and attacking Paul. Now, notice several significant facts. First of all, Paul called them brothers. He did not treat them as enemies, not even as antagonistic. He did not murmur, gripe, complain, or even attack them. The very opposite is true. He sensed and expressed deep brotherly affection for them. Secondly, Paul begged them. He beseeched them. That is, he was not commanded or instructed, but he was begging and pleading from the heart of a true minister of God. Thirdly, Paul begged them to be as he was, for he had become one of them. He had always loved and cared and shown affection for them. And he wanted them to do the same for him, not to abandon him and turn against him and his ministry. It should be noted that many commentators understand Paul to be saying that he become as they were, that is, a Gentile. Therefore he wanted them to remain as he was, a Gentile who had trusted Christ, and not to turn to Jewish law in seeking God's approval. Fourthly, Paul assured them that what they had done had not injured him at all. He held absolutely no bitterness, no anger, or malice against them. Let's see if we'll make a couple of applications. First of all, the heart of a true preacher is clearly seen in verse 12. Love, affection, kindness, and care for a people who had become critics of the preacher of God. Now, preacher, I know that's a hard thing to do, but we must love, and we must continue to love and show kindness. Second application would be, believers must heed the appeal of the preacher of God. Paul said, be as I am in affection and love. Do not abandon me and turn away from me. Several Christian men who had been touched by the Lord decided to do something practical for their pastor. They decided to pray for him. Now, what's so unusual about that, you might ask? Well, for one particular pastor, it was a brand new sensation. These few laymen had just returned from a Bible study that encouraged them to approach their pastor and tell him they were committed to pray for him on a regular basis. They loved their pastor, but had never thought that such a great man of God needed their awkward prayers. After all, they were just laymen, and he was the pastor. During their appointment with their pastor, they shared with him what God had led them to do. In response to their offer, the pastor took a deep breath and told them a sad truth. He said, men, in all of my 15 years of being in the ministry, no group of men have ever come to me to tell me they were praying for me. He was truly touched by their Christian love. And make no mistake about it, from that day forward he preached, pastored, and prayed with a greater confidence, knowing that he was not in the battle alone. Does your pastor know that you're praying for him? What about you, preacher? Are you praying for your congregation? Why don't you ask some men in your church to start praying for you on a regular basis? They may not know you need their prayers. Teach them from the Word of God. Let's talk about the second point. Welcome true ministers of God. found in verses 13 through verse 16. Now there are three areas which the true minister should be welcomed. First of all, true ministers should be welcomed in their witness. Now notice the Galatians had welcomed Paul when he first preached the gospel to them, and they had readily responded to his message. They did not question his call to preach, nor the message that he preached. There was no criticism nor censoring of his person or his preaching. Their arms were wide open, and their hearts were receptive. Notice that Paul was appealing for the same spirit of welcome and receptivity now. No other spirit should ever characterize God's people, not toward the minister of God, not toward any child of God. Secondly, true preachers should be welcomed even in the infirmities and weakness of their flesh. But too often, this is not true. Churches and believers sometimes abandon and ignore the minister of God when he is stricken in body or in spirit. When Paul first went to the Galatian churches, he was stricken with some infirmity. Just what the infirmity was is really not known, although the best guess seems to be some serious eye problem, according to verse 15. Now, the point is that the Galatians did not despise him. They did not reject him. They received him as an angel or messenger from God himself. And this last fact stresses just how wide open the welcome was to Paul. There was no lack in receiving and caring for the minister of God. They would have even plucked out their own eyes and given them to Paul if they had been able. A third point, true ministers should be welcomed in the truth they proclaim. Paul had been proclaiming the truth. That is, a person is justified by faith and not by law nor by works. Not by trying to earn God's acceptance, by doing good deeds here and there. Was the church going to treat Paul as an enemy because he had told them the truth? Let's make an application. How many churches turn against the minister of God because he preaches and tells the truth? The church must always welcome the minister who speaks and proclaims the truth of God. Paul said, Philippians chapter 2, verse 29, receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness and hold such in reputation. Speaking of a pastor. If the minister of God tells the truth, will he be exempt from persecution? John wished it were so. Let's hear his painful story. John was a man of God who had forsaken all to follow Christ. He was willing to go wherever God wanted. It looked like a golden opportunity for a young minister. The congregation wanted him, and he felt led to the church. Right up front, he told the congregation that he would never compromise the truth. And they replied, Preacher, that's great. We're sure glad to have you with us. As the years went by, the truth from God's Word put the congregation in the fork of the road. There's an old saying that the truth hurts. Instead of responding in repentance to the Lord, many in the church began to shift the blame for the guilty hearts to the pastor's sermons. The result was tragic. John was spiritually tarred and feathered. The people were looking for something that would tickle their ears. To his credit, John refused to give in to the pressure, counting the truth more important than acceptance by man. Now, when you preach the truth, you make sure that it is done in love and not out of retaliation or self-interest. The third point of the outline is found in verse 17. Guard against and reject false preachers. Guard against and reject false preachers. Now notice that the false teachers, that is the Judaizers, the religionists, were zealous in their teaching, and they were out to secure a larger following as possible. Note how they went about it. By excluding the people, trying to cut them off from the minister of God. They not only sought people through the merits of their own teaching, but they attacked and tore down the minister in order to alienate the people from the preacher. Now note the difference between what the Christian minister, Paul, was doing and what the false teachers were doing. Or, to put it in the form of a question, what is the difference between evangelistic efforts of the true preacher of God and false teachers? Well, false teachers seek to focus people upon the law, works, effort, ritual, ceremony, observances, sacrifices, rules, and regulations, upon something that requires man to work at being good or doing good in order to become acceptable to God. And the true preacher of God seeks to focus people upon Jesus Christ, God Himself, His love, honor, and praise, upon the fact that God Himself has provided the way for man to become acceptable to Him, and that way is through His Son, Jesus Christ. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves." In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1 through 2, Paul said, "Now the Spirit speaketh expressly, that in the latter time some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron." Now let's take up the fourth point of the outline, and that's found in verses 18 through verse 20. And that is, receive true preachers always. Paul said the church should always welcome ministers who seek to do well, preachers who labor for the church's welfare. Now notice that he was encouraging the church not only to accept his ministry, but the ministry of other true preachers. They must reject false preachers. 2 John verse 9 through verse 11 tell you to reject false preachers and have nothing to do with false preachers. But they must receive the ministry of true preachers in order to grow in Christ. Paul himself demonstrated three reasons why the church is to receive true preachers of God. First of all, true preachers hold believers within their hearts as dear children. The minister's heart is ever so tender, warm, caring, protecting, and providing toward the church. Now, see what Paul said in verse 19, "My little children." See, he loved them. And we need to treat our congregation as our little children, that God has given us the responsibility of under shepherding and leading the flock. Secondly, true ministers agonize over the growth of believers. They seek Christ to be formed in the believers. They want believers living as Christ lived and conformed into the image of Christ. No wonder Jesus said in Matthew 23, verse 37, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not." Thirdly, true ministers guard the church against error. Now notice, if there's any doubt about the matter, he warns the church. Paul said, Philippians chapter 3, verse 18, "For many walk, of whom I've told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ." Let's make an application. No believer or church should ever reject the ministry of a preacher who seeks to help them and to grow them in Christ. How open is your church's pulpit to visiting ministers? Do you as a pastor have every gift in the Bible and a resume that lists every possible spiritual experience? Of course you don't, Pastor. And a healthy church wants and needs inputs from other parts of the body of Christ. Without an extended vision, a church will never grow. As a matter of fact, it will eventually dry up and die. About 350 years ago, a shipload of travelers landed on the northeast coast of America. The first year, they established a town site. The next year, they elected a town government. The third year, the town government planned to build a road 5 miles westward into the wilderness. In the fourth year, the people tried to impeach the town government because they thought it was a waste of public funds to build a road 5 miles westward into the wilderness. Who needed to go there anyway? Here were people who had the vision to see 3,000 miles across the ocean and overcome great hardships to get there. But in just a few years, they were not able to see even 5 miles out of town. They had lost their pioneering vision. With a clear vision of what we can become in Christ, no ocean of difficulty is too great. Without it, we rarely move beyond our current boundaries. We must have a vision. The Bible says in Proverbs 28:19, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." Without a vision from outside our walls of comfort, we'll never know what God is doing in His world. Pastor, don't you want to know? All right, let's go to the third appeal in the fivefold appeal, to be justified by faith alone. And in this appeal, we're going to listen to what the law really says. Listen to what the law really says. And we'll read through the remainder of the chapter, beginning with verse 21 and reading through verse 31. And the aim of this lesson is to fine-tune our spiritual hearing and understanding. And the memory verse will be Galatians chapter 4, verse 28. "Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise." Now let's read the scriptures, beginning with verse 21 of Galatians chapter 4. "Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Agar. For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free. That's grace, which is the mother of us all. And you ought to cross-reference this verse with Revelation chapter 22, verse 17. For it is written, Rejoice, thou barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath a husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Now, noted radio announcer Paul Harvey is known for his famous phrase, and now for the rest of the story. And this was the Apostle Paul's exact point to the churches of Galatia. There were some church members who do not fully understand, or did not fully understand, all that the law was saying. What they needed was an adjustment to their spiritual hearing. And once that adjustment was made, then they too would come to know the rest of the story. And that is, the way to heaven is not by works, nor by the law. A person cannot do enough works, nor keep enough laws to become perfectly good. And for a person to live in God's presence, he has to be perfect. What then is the way to heaven? If a person cannot be good enough, nor do enough works to make it to heaven, how can he get there? The answer is by faith in the promise of God. God has promised heaven to those who believe in His Son, to those who genuinely trust Jesus Christ to save them from their sins. However, most people in the world do not believe the promise of God. They still think they have to earn and work their way into the favor of God, that they have to build up a long list of good works that will force God to accept them. They think that they have to make themselves righteous by being good and doing religious things in order to enter heaven. Therefore, they place themselves under the rules and regulations of the law and of religion, and they do the best they can to make it to heaven. And this is the appeal of this passage. The person who approaches God through the works of religion and law must listen to what the law really says. Now, this study has 6 points, and we need to have 6 understandings. First of all, point number 1 is understanding 1. A person must hear the law and grasp its implications. That's found in verse 21. Point 2 is this. It's an understanding number 2. Abraham had 2 sons, found in verse 22 and 23. Point 3 is understanding 3. The 2 mothers represent 2 separate covenants, verses 24 through verse 28. Point 4 is understanding 4. Legalism persecutes and enslaves believers, verse 29. Point 5 is understanding 5. Legalism is to be cast out and have no inheritance, verse 30. And finally, point 6 is understanding 6. Legalism has no claim upon the children of grace, verse 31. Now we'll talk about these individually now. Let's take up point number 1, and that is understanding 1. A person must hear the law and grasp its implications, as found in verse 21. The legalists and religionists are the persons who approach God by the law or by the works of goodness or religion. The legalist and religionist needs to hear and really understand what they are doing, just how they are trying to approach God. They need to understand the implication of what they are doing. And that's what Paul says in verse 21. Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? In other words, do you understand it? Have you grasped its implications? All right, let's take up point number 2, and that is, Abraham had 2 sons. Look at verse 22 and 23. Now remember that the way to become acceptable to God and to enter heaven is not by law and not by the works of goodness, but by the promise of God. Paul uses the illustration of Abraham to prove the point. And you can cross-reference Genesis chapter 16, 17, and 21. But briefly and simply, Abraham had two sons. One son had been promised by God to Abraham through his wife Sarah. However, many years passed without Sarah's having a child. She seemed incapable. She became discouraged. So she sent a slave girl, Hagar, into Abraham. And Hagar bore a son, Ishmael. Sometime later, however, God kept his promise, and the impossible happened. Sarah, well beyond childbearing years, bore a son, and his name was Isaac. Now note the facts about Ishmael. He was born through a natural process. He was born into slavery, being born of a slave girl. He was born because of the work, effort, and will of Sarah. He was born because of the fleshly impulses, urges, and attraction of Abraham. Now note the facts about Isaac. He was born as a free woman. He was born as a free man, born of a free woman, Sarah. He was born by the promise of God alone. God had promised Abraham that Sarah would bear a son, and when Isaac was born, Abraham and Sarah were both well beyond the years of childbearing, 100 years old. Isaac was a miracle child, born miraculously by the working of God, all because God had promised Abraham a son. Isaac was, therefore, a promised child. And the point is this, and it must be remembered, Ishmael, the child born by human ingenuity, energy, and effort, was born into slavery. But Isaac, the child promised by God, was born miraculously by the promise of God, by his love and power alone, all because he had made the promise. Isaac was born by the grace of God and by the grace of God alone. We must remember that even our best efforts fall short of gaining a place in heaven. It has to be grace and grace alone. Listen to this humorous story that illustrates the point so well. In his mission field, a certain missionary had to do many things for himself and his family. When the baby grew too big for the carriage, he started to build a bed for the child. And after he prepared the wood, he glued the pieces and was ready to complete the bed. His wife thought it too cold to work in the shed, so he brought the materials into the kitchen and started to work. When the bed was finished, the baby was brought to the kitchen and placed in it, while his parents looked on admiringly. And suddenly the father had a disquieting thought. Suppose the bed would not go through the door. Quickly he measured the door and found the bed 1 inch too wide to pass through. Now there are many people who spend their time building their lives according to the plan of this world. They take great pride in their work. The day will come when they suddenly realize the measurements will not allow them to pass through heaven's door. Let's take up point number 3. And that is found in verses 24 through verse 28. The two mothers represent two covenants. The two mothers represent two covenants. Paul says that these things are an allegory. That is, an illustration of truth can be seen and drawn from the event. Now, when looking closely at the story, we can see how the mothers, Hagar and Sarah, represent the two covenants, the covenant of law and the covenant of God's grace or promise. Let's take up Hagar. Hagar was a type of the old covenant between God and man. That is, she was a type of the law. And two things are said about the law. Hagar, that is, the law, bears children to slavery. The law says do this and do not do that. It demands and insists on obedience. It enslaves a person to do exactly what it says. Therefore, if a person hopes to approach God in his own goodness, merit, virtue, morality, and righteousness, he is in bondage to the law. He must keep it in order to be good and moral and righteous and to earn the favor of God. The law, the rules and regulations of goodness and righteousness enslaves him. Keep in mind, Paul is not saying the law is not good. We're to live righteously and morally, but we're not acceptable to God because of our goodness and self-effort. We do not save ourselves. We're not to be praised because of our works and goodness. Praise belongs to God. God is the one who saves us. This is what is being discussed. And Hagar, which represents the law, also represents the very center of a religion of law and works, which was Jerusalem of that day, according to verse 25. Now notice that Paul makes two connections to stress the point. He says Hagar stands for Mount Sinai, the mount in Arabia where the law was given. And he says Hagar and Mount Sinai both picture the very center of religion of law and works the Jerusalem of that day. Of course, Hagar also pictures any religion, church, people, or person who seeks to be righteous and acceptable to God and heaven through works and law. Now, on the other hand, Sarah was a type of the new covenant between God and man, the covenant of grace or promise. Now, two things are said about the grace and promise of God to man. First of all, Sarah, that is grace, is seen in the Jerusalem which is above, the heavenly Jerusalem. Heavenly Jerusalem is the spiritual and eternal city which God has promised to those who approach Him through faith. Secondly, Sarah in grace and the promise of a heavenly city are all free. Any person who accepts God's promise of a heavenly city, which is eternal, who accepts His promise enough to believe it with all his heart, basing all he is and has upon that promise, is acceptable to God. God takes the man's sheer faith, the faith that has cast itself totally upon the promise of God, and counts it as the man's righteousness. Therefore, the man becomes acceptable to God. He is given the promise of God freely, without price, without having to work for it by keeping rules and laws. Now notice the second result as well. The covenant of grace ends up with more children than the Jewish legalists. This is a prophecy which simply predicted that more Gentiles would believe the grace of God than Jews. And you can find that prophecy in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 1. And it says very plainly that that the mother of the free would bear more children. Okay? The point is forcefully stated. Now we, brothers, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. Believers are those who have believed in Jesus Christ, have been given birth by God, that is a spiritual birth. We receive the promise of God. God freely takes our faith and counts it as righteousness. Our faith is credited, that is imputed, counted as the righteousness which we lack within ourselves. And this is the glorious promise of God's grace, the covenant of grace which God has now made with man. Man can now inherit the promised land, that is Canaan, the heavenly Jerusalem, or city of God, and live eternally with God. In Romans chapter 4, verse 13 and 14, Paul said, "For the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect." Now, let's take up the fourth point in the outline, and that is legalism persecutes and enslaves believers. And you can find that in verse 29. Now, Ishmael ridiculed and mocked and persecuted Isaac. And Paul draws upon this very fact to show why believers are being persecuted. It is because men try to approach God in the flesh, that is, by their own energy and by their own effort in trying to be good and righteous. The person in the flesh, consciously or subconsciously, is trying to secure credit, recognition, esteem, approval, acceptance, and praise from God, all by his own energy and effort. Therefore he mocks, ridicules, and persecutes the believer who says that self-effort and self-righteousness are not enough and will not make a person acceptable to God. Secondly, the person in the flesh has to confess human weakness and inadequacy. That is, he cannot make himself acceptable to God because he is too sinful, too short of God's glory, too unrighteous, too unholy, too polluted, too hopeless, too helpless, and too undeserving. The person in the flesh refuses to accept this fact. He wants to think highly of himself and place himself on a level close to God. Therefore, when a believer comes along and says that a person has to be born again by the Spirit of God, the natural man reacts. He refuses to accept the fact that his flesh, his own energy and effort, is unable to earn, win, and merit God's approval. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 11, "Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake." There are few things sadder in life than that of a Christian believer who has been bound up by legalism. Charles Simpson, in the Pastoral Renewal, writes, and I quote, "I met a young man not long ago who dives for exotic fish for aquariums. He said one of the most popular aquarium fish is the shark. And he explained that if you catch a small shark and confine it, it will stay of size proportionate to the aquarium. Sharks can be 6 inches long yet fully matured. But if you turn them loose in the ocean, they grow to the normal length of 8 feet. Now that also happens to some Christians. I've seen the cutest little 6-inch Christians who swim around in a little puddle. But if you put them in a larger arena, into the whole of creation, only then can they become great, unquote. So where are you swimming, Pastor? In a tank of legalism or in the joyful sea of freedom? Let's take up point number 5. And that is, legalism is to be cast out and have no inheritance, according to verse 30. Legalism is to be cast out and have no inheritance. The law cannot coexist with the grace of God. The son of Hagar, the law, shall not be heir with the son of Sarah, that is grace. The fact of coming judgment could not be illustrated any clearer. Ishmael was cast out so that he would not share in the inheritance with Isaac. Now that does not mean Ishmael could not have believed and been saved. He was just not the child of promise. He represented the law. But if he sought God and God's righteousness and God's salvation, then he could have been saved. But God will never accept anyone who approaches Him by law or by works. Why? Because the person has to stand before God saying, God, here are my works and my goodness and my righteousness, a list of laws I have kept, and a list of my contributions. Such a claim is merely deceptive, and it's boasting and bragging of what you've done in the flesh. Such a profession presents to God only human effort and energy, works and deeds. And God is perfect, and therefore only perfection can exist with Him. No matter how much good and how many works a person presents to God, they are not enough, for they do not make him perfect. Therefore he must be cast from God's presence, but not the person of promise. The person of promise approaches God saying, Father, you are my Savior and Lord. You have loved me so much that you sent your Son to die for me. I believe with all my heart that Christ died for me, and I surrender all I am and have into His keeping. I cast myself totally upon Jesus Christ's righteousness and His death for my sins. God has promised that the person who sincerely believes in His Son shall never perish, but shall have everlasting life. He shall inherit the promise of God. God will accept his belief, counting it as righteousness, and the man shall inherit the promise. Again, I quote Romans chapter 4, verse 13. For the promise that he should be heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Now, point number 6, found in verse 31, and that is, legalism has no claim upon the children of grace. Believers are the children of grace, not of law. The fact is clearly seen in all that's been said above. Believers, all men, if they would accept the fact, have so much for which to thank God. God has loved the world and demonstrated His love beyond anything any person could ever ask. Jesus Christ said in John 3:16, For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Now God gives each one of His children an eternal assurance of His care for them. Legalism cannot have us anymore. We are now the children of grace. This reality gives the Christian believer peace of mind. And on the other side of the cassette tape, I want to share a story with you about two brethren who differed on the question of the believer's eternal security in Christ.